Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 1 Corinthians. We'll be in chapter 9 today and picking up pretty much where Paul had left off. And in fact, of course, when we look at this from chapter 8 and 9, whenever we see chapter breaks, let's remember that they're put there really by people that have translated since. This was just one continuing letter. Paul's context here all along up to this point, I should say, for the last chapter to two, has been to deal with freedoms that we might have. And he's going to make this very personal to himself, as he has already done with about how he would not eat foods if they were going to stumble somebody. We see that at the end of verse 13 of chapter 8, where he says, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat again, lest I make my brother stumble." So that was his governing principle when it came to the idea of things that may have been sacrificed to idols. Remember, he's in Corinth at the time, so the idea of temple worship and the paganism of it was everywhere that you could see, and the people from Corinth would have been more than just a little familiar with it. So his point still is that matter of I have liberty and I have freedom to do things. Now, he's going to continue to address that, and he's going to also do it in the way of examining it through the prism of him being an apostle. So there are two schools of thought on this. Is he using this as a way of saying, along those same lines of freedom, let me give you an example since I'm an apostle? Is he using that as kind of the rhetorical way of I guess you could say building on his previous thoughts? Or is this also something that in the letter that was written to him, that there were those people who were questioning his authority and him being an apostle? We certainly know this. There were people who had a real interest in trying to undo and undermine his work in ministry. And you see it mentioned in his writings quite often. You see the opposition that he got just about everywhere that he went. So when it comes to this particular chapter, is he doing this and giving this defense because it's been something that's been brought to his attention that it was being questioned? Or is he doing it in the context of, let me give you an example further from the idea of wanting to say that, yes, we have freedom, but we don't necessarily have to exercise that freedom? I think you could probably make the case for both. There may be elements of both of those reasons why he says what he says here. But let's get to the big picture of this before we look at the text, and that's very simply this. There are things that we may be able to do. He has already said, all things are lawful to me, but not all things are edifying, expedient, useful. There are a number of different ways that you can use words to kind of get and convey the thought that he has behind it. So the bottom line to this is he would be saying, yeah, I may be able to do this, but is it the right thing? Now, he's going to start off that way, and he's doing it in the context of being an apostle. Now, let's remember, when it came to the apostles and the people that were there with Jesus, they were the ones who heard him, saw him, they were around him. If we want to use what John says about it, we've seen him, we've heard him, we've touched him, we've handled him, and we're here to tell you about who he is. In John's first epistle, that's how he puts it together. In this case, Paul doesn't, and he doesn't have that, if you will, that pedigree to have walked with them. In fact, he would have been a persecutor of those people in the early church. We know that from the book of Acts, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. We know that about Paul. So with all that being said, he wants to go ahead and make sure that we understand that he has this unique position of being an apostle. And so he gives that as a reason for the credibility of who he is, the freedom that he has to do things that other apostles do, and yet he chooses not to do them for reasons to him. And we're going to get to the different ways that people will look at this, and again, that there's no real blanket way to look at a person that may or may not be supported in their ministry. And we'll get to all of that as we go. Chapter 9, verse 1 says, "Am I not an apostle?" Now, let's make sure that we understand. He's going to ask a number of rhetorical questions because he's obviously writing it in a letter. They can't have a dialogue on this. So he's asking these questions rhetorically because he's going to answer them. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Don't I have freedom to do these things? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? Now, this idea of him seeing Jesus is one of those very fascinating kind of things, because we know that that had to have been a prerequisite to be a genuine apostle, as like the 12. And what that simply means, when they were with Jesus, and then Judas did the things that he had done and he died, they were going to bring another person on. Matthias is the guy that they decided on, but we know from the opening verses in chapter 1 of the book of Acts that they wanted to find a replacement for Judas. And so Peter is the one who says they have to be one of us who has seen the risen Savior. So if that's a qualification, and it's a must-have qualification, then for Paul to say that I'm an apostle means that he has to have seen Jesus. So he even takes that question off as far as being an objection against him, because he says right here, I have seen him. We know when he writes about the time in Galatia, that he had that time with the Lord directly. He has seen him. If nothing else, from chapter 9 of the book of Acts, we know that Jesus met with him on the road on his way to Damascus. Now, of course, he couldn't see him. He was blinded. There's all of that, but there doesn't seem to be any question that he has had a face-to-face with Jesus. He says it right here in his own words. Now, he says, so in verse 2, now, if I am an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am, or if I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Now, he uses this as saying to them, you guys are the evidence, you're the proof among many, but you can look no further than just in the mirror, and you will see the evidence of my being sent by God as I have been, because look at the fruit in your own lives. So he uses them as their self-evidence. Now, he says this, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are our seal of apostleship in the Lord. Now, my defense to those who examine me is this, do we have no right to eat or drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, a way of saying Peter? So what he's going to do, and there are a few more verses that go along these same lines, he's going to compare himself to what some of the other apostles were doing. Now, this might be known to the people in Corinth. We don't have a great deal of record of this in the New Testament. So as he says these and makes these arguments, we don't really know, but we can put some pieces together here. So he compares himself to the other apostles, not by way of making comparison, but saying, they're free to do these things. I'm free to do this. There's nothing wrong with either one of these options. There is something that I want to point out that I think is pretty interesting. When he says this, do we have the right to take along a believing wife? Now, there are those that would say that people that are in the service, and many would say that these were the priests, especially of Catholic doctrine, they would say all the way back to the first century, these were priests. Well, they were obviously married. And here's something else that's pretty interesting too when you stop to think about it. He says, are we not allowed to bring along a believing wife? Verse 5. As also do the other apostles. That's one group of people, the apostles, and he mentions those. He also mentions Peter separately from the apostles, though they are, but Peter had a place of real prominence. But interesting, right in the middle, he says, and the brothers of the Lord. So these are clearly not brothers in the faith, because the apostles and Peter would have been those. They're not cousins, because the word here is adelphos. And it isn't there are two other Greek words that are used in the New Testament. It is neither of those. When he says brothers, he means brothers, as in siblings. So for that idea that Jesus didn't have half brothers and sisters, there's just too many passages similar to this that would prove otherwise. But that's for another time. Now, verse 6 says this, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? So there apparently, the idea could be that if they were these people that were going and preaching the gospel and doing the things that they were doing, they could expect to be supported by the churches. But in this case, the other guys don't do this. But does that mean that Paul and Barnabas, or Paul speaking of himself, does that mean that me and Barnabas, we can't work and earn a living to ourselves? And he's going to go into why that's the case. Now, it's important for us to also remember, when we read Paul's words here, what we know of the of the people who were doing ministry at the time and the other ones like he has mentioned here, if they were more locked into a particular place or if they were stationary, there would be the same interaction that they would have with people all the time. And those people may very well decide to support them. Paul and Barnabas were itinerant guys. They went from place to place to place. And if they didn't have a way of really having a lot of hand-to-hand first, contact kind of day-to-day relationship with people, they didn't want to give the impression from what he says here, the only thing you can take away from it, we didn't want to go from place to place and always have our hand out asking for money, because then it would just nullify what we were looking to do. And I think this would be a great thing as far as the church people nowadays, that you have so many celebrities that won't go anywhere unless they're getting paid to go. It's an amazing thing. Well, Paul would say here, there's nothing wrong with either one. He's giving an example here where I do the opposite of those guys, but it doesn't make them wrong. It's just God has put me in this place to do this at this time, and God is able to do different things in different places. It's up to him. So he's going to expand on this a bit. Verse 7 tells us this: whoever goes out to war on his own expense, or who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock but does not drink of the milk of the flock. Now, 3 questions that he asks, again, they're all rhetorical, and they're meant for a person to say, well, nobody would do that. Of course. And that's his point. So he, as an apostle, would want to be able to say, we're going to do this work, and in a normal human sense, they're going to have support, or they're going to labor with their hands. And so here in verse 8 he says, now, do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say also the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, you will not muzzle an ox while he treads out the grain. Is it the oxen then that God is concerned with? Now, we have been studying this. This is in Deuteronomy 25, and it's just in that instruction. We just looked at it in the last week or two on the Monday night studies. But there's only that one verse, and you don't find it anywhere else, that you don't muzzle the ox. Now, it's obvious that if an oxen is doing the work that he's doing and he leans down to eat something, let him go. He's laboring, he's working. Paul uses that one little obscure verse, and he makes a point of it, and it's a brilliant one at that. So he says this, and I love how he reasons through this. He says this at the end of verse 9. Is it the oxen that God is concerned with? To some extent, yeah, don't muzzle him out, but understand the overall principle. The oxen is one who is laboring, and he is doing this work, so it's okay if he is able to eat of the fruit that is there of the place where he's working. Paul is basically making that same case, though he will not be the one who partakes. He's basically laying out the case and saying, for those who do, and I could, though I don't, there's nothing wrong with the church supporting the person who ministers to them. Now again, here he's already said, there's no question that I've ministered to you. There's no question that I have this position. There's no question of the spiritual authority that I have and the position that I have. Look at yourselves. You're the evidence. You're the fruit of that ministry. So he's able to say this in verse 10. Now, does he say this altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt. He answers his own question. This is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be a partaker of this hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing that we should reap your material things? Now, again, we don't talk like this. This is not kind of the English that we would use, but his point is, if we have done this ministry in and amongst and through you, and we have labored among you, is it a wrong thing for us to be able to ask for your support? Now, of course, as we read on a little further, he's not asking for their support. He's just saying, he's laying it out there in case there's the objection. We have every right to do this like the other guys. So he's laying out that case, but he's about to say, but we don't use that liberty that we would have to make such a request. And that really is what he's been dealing with for the last couple of chapters. We have the freedom to do these things, but just because we have the freedom doesn't mean that it's the best option. And in his case, it would have been probably not a great option. Oddly enough, in the culture where they are, more than likely, this is the whole think about this. There's the aristocracy of the Romans and the Greeks and that whole part, and there are the commoners, and then there are the elites. They weren't the ones that worked with their hands, and yet there would be the people that were the commoners, and they were the laborers. They were looked down on. Now here, Paul, if we follow that line of reasoning, Paul would be seen as a person that wouldn't be purporting himself to be this elite person by demanding that people take care of him, although he could, and he was certainly in an elite class as far as ministers. In fact, there was no one like him to the Gentiles. He was unique in all of biblical history for the work that he did among the Gentiles. So it's a fascinating thing that he says, and this man Paul is a fascinating character. Well, he says this. Now, verse 12, if others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more so? So apparently there were other people there that were being supported in Corinth for doing ministry. And Paul would say, well, let me just ask you the question. Are we not really above all of them? We know he spent 1.5 years here. We know he did more ministry around these people than anybody else could have because of the mandate that he had been given. The being sent to the Gentiles, this was Paul's mission, his ministry. In fact, we don't know who those people are that could be mentioned here. They're not recorded for us, but the Bible records for us who Paul is. This is his writing. And how many other churches did he write to? So, he's able to say, we're above those guys, but he's not saying it in the way of a boast. Look at what he says. Nevertheless, we've never used this right, but we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel. Now, that idea that we could demand these things from you, but for reasons that he has taken to himself, we feel that would be a hindrance. Why? People would say you're just in it for the money. I've had people throw that one at me. The only reason you do what you do is because you get a paycheck. Well, it's kind of funny because here I am, 2020, and I've left my position as a senior pastor. And that was a paid staff position. Okay, I can leave that, and I don't say this as a boast. It was just God gave me the freedom to go ahead and do this, and if it gets supported, it doesn't matter. I'm going to teach the Bible regardless of what kind of, quote, income there would be. That's not relevant to me. So there's this wonderful freedom. Well, in verse 13 he says, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of those things of the temple? And those who serve at the altar, they're partakers of the offering of the altar. Now, he's making an allusion back to the law, and he's going to do a little bit of that with Moses, as he has already done, but he's going to kind of go back to a pre-church kind of an understanding. The Levites were given the position of ministering between God and man. They weren't given an allotment of the land. We're studying this. We have studied it on the evening studies on Monday nights. And Sunday, when I was back in California, we were going through all of these ministries of the Levites, and they didn't have land allotments or anything else. It was the other tribes who were going to support them and make sure that they had all of their needs met, because their full-time ministry, their full-time vocation wasn't plowing fields and raising livestock. It was ministering for the people before the Lord. Okay, so they were supported, and Paul uses this as an example. Verse 14, even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Now, this commandment we don't have anywhere, but if that's the case, and he's using the Old Testament as the allusion to this, he could say those who make it their full-time ministry, they can be supported in that. Now, we see that abused horribly all throughout the country and really throughout the world. The things that are done in the name of God by, quote, preachers, and they do so for the money of it. It's an amazing thing if the day ever comes where it's like this for the churches in the West, like it is in the persecuted parts of the world. How many of those guys wouldn't be able to be, quote, pastors because it's no longer for pay? Or if it was something that would really cost them, like their lives or their freedoms, would they all of a sudden kind of be quiet? Probably a good chance of that. Well, that day's coming. Verse 15. He says this in verse 15, but I have used none of these things. Now, notice again, he doesn't condemn those things. He says, I have the right to do it. But here he's able to say, I have this choice. It doesn't make him right. It doesn't make him wrong. It doesn't make those other people right or wrong. It's person by person, case by case, as God opens those doors. And that's all that matters. What does the Lord call every individual to do? That's Paul's point here. Now, before we read on, and I know I've said it, but let me repeat it. Given what he was doing, where he was, the time in history, all kinds of factors, Paul was able to say, it's better for me to work with my hands, given what God has given me to do, with the opposition that I have, and all the factors. He says, I'm just going to work. I'm not going to be any kind of a burden upon the church for any variety of reasons, from his conscience all the way down to whether it would in any way hinder his ability to do or to have people listen to what he is saying. That's the important part. So, I have used none of these things, verse 15, nor have I written these things that it should be done for me. I'm not saying this so that you'll pity me and having some kind of ulterior motive for saying, I'll take it on the chin, hoping that by reverse psychology that people will start throwing money at him. He's not doing it for that. He says, it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. And when you see boasting, it's not bragging. It's just being able to say, it would be better that I don't receive any money so that it would take away from me the ability to say, I have the freedom to do this and God has provided. He would rather die than have that being taken away. So verse 16 says, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel or the good news. So he says, if I'm doing this for pay, then there's really nothing in it as far as me being able to say, I do this for the Lord and the Lord is in this, or all those kinds of things that he could be able to say. I don't want to have this freedom taken away from me, because in that freedom, I have the ability to say, I do this for no benefit to me whatsoever. The benefit is for you. And so he says, and woe, if I ever did not proclaim the gospel for whatever reason, woe is what he calls upon himself. So he says, because if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I don't preach it. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if I do it against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. But so his point is, I have to do this of my own free will. If I grudge against it, this stewardship that God has given to me is really made null and void, because then I'm doing it out of constraint, and because I think that I have to or need to, especially if he's being paid for it, then of course he's got to dance. And he's saying, I want to have that kind of thing hanging over me. It's an interesting thing for anyone who serves in any kind of ministry to look at something like this, and it does make you question your motives. Why do I do what I do? What's the reason for it? Am I given to it, or is it something that I just do because? Those are all super important questions. And, again, each person, they'll stand before God. They give account for the things that they do and why they do them. What's the motivation behind it? Here we get Paul, in the big picture, is able to say, look, I've got freedom. It's clear that I'm an apostle. Take a look at your own lives. I have the freedom to be married. I have the freedom to do these things. I have the freedom to do this and be supported by the churches there, but I choose not to do those things. Why? Because God has given me an alternative way. Myself, Barnabas, he speaks for him as well. We'd rather work than have people support us, because then there would be people to be able to say the only reason they do it is because they get paid or because they are supported. Take away their support, would they still continue to do this? That would be the objection. And Paul says, I can take all those things off the table. And I can have also that idea that my boast or my ability to say, I do this because of the Lord, you could not prove otherwise. And that's what Paul really wants to get to here. So he says in verse 18, so he says, what is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I can present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. So he says, so what's in it for me? No one will be able to question the motivation. There won't be some ulterior motive that they could accuse him of having. He's able to say, I do this because I want to do this, because I'm called by God to do it, not because of any benefit for me. All of the benefit is for the people who hear. That is it. That's the extent of his whole message. And I think what a beautiful thing that is. And again, this, with every single day, the more that we consider this, and again, remember, I'm coming to you in May of 2020. our whole world has changed in a most fundamental manner. And so the big church as we know it isn't meeting currently all around the world and especially here in the West. Now, I don't know what churches will survive, which ones won't. I mean, bills have to get paid, but it's an interesting thing that there is still the freedom to teach the Bible. And here we're able to do it online. There's no cost to it. We're able to do this. It's just kind of a wonderful thing to be able to do. But Paul is saying there's an incredible freedom in this when we're not stuck with the encumbrances of life. Now, again, I don't ever want to look down my nose at anyone who does this as a salaried position. In fact, when I was in California, it gave me an incredible freedom to do a lot of things that if I had a regular 9-to-5 thing, it'd been tough to teach 3 Bible studies a week and do the other things in ministry, the conferences and the interviews and all the rest of that. It's wonderful that God is able to do the things that he does in ministry without it being a cookie cutter way of things. Now, Paul is going to continue this thought, and this is, to me, some of the most important reasoning that you'll see of Paul basically anywhere. And there is such a balance with this of being able to meet the needs of any particular group of people without compromise. So I don't picture what Paul is doing here, and oftentimes people try to use this as an excuse for doing things that in the moral sense or immoral sense or whatever else, they might try to find some justification in this. And so Paul doesn't look to do any of those things. In fact, what he would look to do is to try to say, who's my audience and how do I address them? I'm going to give you a couple of examples as we go on, but let's take a look at verse 19. For though I am free from all men, picking up on verse 18, I'm free, I don't owe my existence to anyone. I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. Now, there was the servant that was the hired servant, and they had really no choice in the matter. There were those other people that were the indentured servants, what we call the doulos or the douloi here. Here is the person that says, I have of my own free will indebted myself to someone else to serve them. I've done this of my own free will. That is what Paul is saying here. So I'm free to do this, but in my freedom, I have indebted myself to this cause. I love this. It's so cool. So he says this, and again, remember, for a man to make the statements that he makes means that he had to be conversant in so many different things. He had to be understanding of these matters. He was certainly as conversant as anyone that there has ever been in the finer points of doctrine and theology from a Christian point of view, from a Jewish point of view, but he felt completely comfortable to engage the pagan culture of the Gentiles here in Greece and in what is modern Turkey. Asia Minor is what it's referred to in the New Testament. So what an amazing thing that he's able to say, I have acquired this depth of knowledge that I could go and speak to anybody in any place at any time and do so coherently and from a place of knowledge. It really is for pastors, especially those that are teachers or anybody that serves in ministry that teaches. We should be able to have a conversation with anyone that God sends to us. So it is important. The older that we get, the better read we are on a number of topics and variety of things. Paul's able to say, I do that, and he's going to give the explanation of it. So he said, to the Jews, I became as a Jew. So we know that it was his common thing. He would come into a town, the first place that he would go is to the synagogues. Okay, you're not going to go talk to them like a bunch of pagan Gentiles. You're going to talk to them based upon the law. You're going to go into the synagogues. That's where the Jewish people were. Paul, because of his equipping and because of what he knows, because of his pedigree, if you will, he could talk among the Jews and have absolute total authority. He was more than likely a member of the Sanhedrin at one point. But if you studied under Gamaliel, yeah, you had some real credibility. You had some bona fides. Well, here he is able to say, to the Jews I became as a Jew that I might win Jewish people. He's making the argument that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah that was spoken of in the Old Testament. We get that from the beginning of the book of Acts chapter 9, where it says he went and he taught that Jesus was the Christ. Well, based on what? What was in the Old Testament? That's all that was there. And he found enough information in the Old Testament to prove that Jesus was the Messiah of Israel. So to the Jews, I became as a Jew. To those that are under the law, as under the law. So he could speak to the countrymen or to those people who held to the finer points of the law, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, those people who put themselves under the constraints. I could talk to them that way. Again, look at his pedigree in the book of Philippians where he says, in fact, let's go ahead and do that. Let's turn to the book of Philippians. And we're going to look at chapter 2. I'm sorry, chapter 3. I said 2. Chapter 3. Now, in verse 4 of Philippians chapter 3, we read this. Though I also might have confidence in the flesh, if anyone thinks that he may have more confidence in the flesh, I more so. Here's his list of who made him, or what made him who he was. Circumcised on the 8th day, which means he was Jewish, and his parents were as well. Of the stock of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin. A Hebrew of Hebrews. And concerning the law, I was a Pharisee. Concerning zeal, I persecuted the church. Concerning the righteousness which is from the law, you couldn't find blame in me. That's, wow. That is a pedigree from a Jewish perspective that very few would be able to say. And it's not a boast. He could back up all of that. So, again, back to Corinthians, when he talks about being a Jew, a countryman, or whether being a person who's under the law, I could talk with any of them. Now, notice why he would do that. I would do this that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law. Now, he's going to put a little caveat, or there's a caveat that's here. Those people that are not Jewish, that are not subject to the law, I would want to be able to speak to them in a way that they would understand, so that they could see what it would be to know who this Jesus is without talking to them as a Jew. They don't have that knowledge. So where are some examples of this? We can find in the book of Acts places where he did all of this. Think of the times that when after his arrest at Jerusalem, chapters 23 or so, from there on, 22, 23, and onward, you would find that he would come to a variety of people. Sometimes it's his countrymen, and he would speak to them as one of them. Other times he would be before guys like Pilate or Felix or those people, and he would speak to them in terms that they would understand. If you look at chapter 17, when he was in Athens, he spoke to them, men of Athens, I perceive. Well, he's not going to talk to them as a Jew. They would have no understanding. He talked to them and even quotes some of their philosophers. So you see, his point is, wherever God sends me, I need to speak to those people in terms that they will understand. Doesn't mean that his language had to be coarse or even profane, as I've heard some people say. What it simply means is that you reason with them in terms that they would understand. He wouldn't go into a synagogue and talk to the Jews like they were a bunch of pagans or a bunch of Gentiles that had no clue about history and Moses and the things that would be spoken in the synagogue. So you get the point? He'd be able to go anywhere without compromise in the moral or any other sense, but he could speak to them in terms that they would understand. And that's what we're getting at here. That's Paul's whole point here. Now, to those that are without the law, not being without the law towards God, but under the law towards Christ, I did this that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak, and that might be in the moral sense or in the ethical sense, to those people who just had no strength, no understanding, I became as them, that I might win the weak. And here's, if people want to get into all the little nuances of each of those groups, here's what he basically says, and this makes it really easy to understand. I have become all things to all men, that I might by some means, or by all means, save some. Now, of course, he realizes it's not he who saves them. It is God who saves them, and it's his message that God uses in order to do so. So he's not taking credit for their salvation. He's simply saying this: I will go anywhere, anytime, to any group of people, speaking to them in ways that they would understand, that I might see some of them come to salvation. That's all he cared about seeing. So again, this is one of those interesting things that I find again in the church, where we become so, unless you're called to be a missionary to some particular part of the world, the church should be able to encounter whoever, whenever. Oftentimes, though, you see weird, out of balance kind of things. Churches that are so concerned with only church things that their outreach is really only trying to drive people to their particular church. and it's not really the genuine presentation of the gospel when the doors are open, or they make the church so open to everyone that they so water down the message and they become themselves incredibly carnal. There's a balance between those two things. Really, the church gathered together to make sure that they knew what it was that they believed, and they were free to operate amongst themselves as brothers and sisters in Jesus. Their evangelism took place outside of the ministry, outside of the doors, outside of the church. Again, a topic for another day. So he says this in verse 23, "Now this I do for the sake of the gospel," or for the sake of the good news, "that I may be a partaker of it with you." So if somebody was to say, well, why do you do all of this, Paul? He basically says, I become all things to all people, that I can see some of them come to be saved. And then he says, and I do this for the sake of the good news. The good news. You can be reconciled to God who loves you, and he can forgive you of his sin. That's the good news. Forgive you of your sin, rather, through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. Good news. I do it for the sake of that. Everything that he has said to this point, he says, I'll do all. Well, we had an unusual problem happen in our study through 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Cut off right at verse 23. And finishing up the thought, and what Paul had to say was his desire was that he would be able to talk to whomever at whatever time in whatever way. And his desire was ultimately that he could win people to the Lord. And so in doing so, as he closes out this chapter, verses 24 through the end of the chapter, he starts to talk about how he himself will discipline himself, and how he even uses terms that they will understand of looking at the world around them and the way of competition. And so he uses kind of like what it would be for a person that's in a sporting event. They have a particular discipline. That's actually what they'll even call them. So like when you look at the people who are Olympians and they'll compete for the things that they do, they have various disciplines. So a person that may be really good at, when you look at the guys that like throw shot puts and stuff like that, they're big, bulky people. You'll never see those people doing any kind of hurdles or any kind of the races. They're just built a different way, and they have a discipline. So Paul is able to use some of those kind of examples. One about winning a race and in that kind of a competition. The other one as if it is a hand-to-hand kind of a combat type of a thing, boxing we might think. And so what he says is that there are things that I've been called to do, and so I put myself in the place of disciplining myself that I could make good on what God has laid hold of him for. And so to the church, it's the same for us as we would consider this. It is this recognition that we have a goal in mind, seeing God face to face. This is our the end of all things for us, is that when we see him face to face, we're completed. We're in that kind of a relationship with him where the temporal things are gone, and we're in the eternal sense. Until then, what Paul wants to make sure is that in the course that he runs and the things that he does, that he is prepared in order to compete in a way or to exist in such a way that would be pleasing to God, and it would make full proof of his ministry. Kind of what he ends up saying to Timothy, making full proof of your ministry, bringing it to completion. So at verse 24, it says, "Now, do you not know that those who run a race all run, but only one receives the prize? So run in such a way that you may obtain it." Now, any of us who have ever spent any time in any kind of athletics, he uses just the idea of running a race. But anybody who competes, if they play sports in the competitive sense, nobody ever wants to go through the trouble, get to the place where they're in that competition to just, be one of the also-rans. They go for that prize. They go that they might be not only competitive, but that they would win. Now, he likens that to the idea of us walking with the Lord, and in our walk here with him to compete, if you will, as a believer, making sure that our lives are again disciplined, that they are being lived in such a way that when we get to see him face to face, there's no shame. We've run the race in the competitive sense with the intention of winning. Now again, as far as a believer is concerned, everybody that competes, if you will, using his analogy, when we get to the finish line, we all, if you will, win, to use that, because salvation is the issue. Our desire is to see him face to face, and there's not just going to be one person saved. All are saved who come to him and put their trust in Jesus. What Paul is trying to make sure that they understand is that in this life and the things which we do, it is for us to pursue as though it was a competition and we have every intention of winning. So what he would probably be arguing against if somebody was having this conversation is like, well, now that I'm saved, I could just coast. Paul would say, great, I'm going to run right past you because there is my destination and I am competing in order to win. I want to be the person that stands before God approved and done well. And so this is the picture, it's the illustration that he's using. And he uses another one here at verse 25, or verse 26 rather. He says, therefore I run, it is verse 25. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. And that means that they have brought themselves into subjection. They have disciplined. They have controlled themselves. So again, if a person wants to be in any kind of a competitive sense, he's going to have to know who it is that he's up against, he or she, and make sure that they have an edge, or that they have a fighting chance, if you will, to compete in such a way to win. Again, if you have no chance against who you're racing against, is it really worth racing? And I don't know. Some people are better about, they just do those things for competition. When I did things like this, and when I played a lot of sports before I wrecked my system and my body, I'm serious. When I was playing in competitive sports, if for chance we didn't have a chance of winning, or we were getting beat thoroughly every time we played, I would probably look for a different team to play on. I'm just that competitive by nature. Well, Paul is using that same kind of a mentality. If we're just going to walk through this life as believers and just be also rans, what a shame that will be when we stand before God, when we are supposed to be those ones who, if you will, competed, using his analogy, but we really left, like the old saying goes, we left nothing on the field. We gave it our all and we went for it with everything that we possibly had. See, without him ever even saying this, by just looking at his life in the missions field, going and doing what he did with the Gentiles, among the Gentiles, and being this guy, the man that we know as Paul, he didn't even need to tell me that he did this. All we need to do is look at his life. And this was a man that clearly was realizing what God had laid hold of him for, and he wasn't going to be found out of shape, lacking for the competition that he was in. And so that's why he's able to say, as he closes this out, when he says, therefore, he says, I run thusly. I run like this, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats at the air. Now, his uncertainty, I think, is really, really crucial that the church understands this. It is important for us to be able to run with absolute certainty about everything that we do. Why is it that we do what we're supposed to? Because Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. Yeah, that means that you're going to have to discipline yourself. It means that you're going to have to, in the spiritual sense, you're going to have to be in shape, because he's calling you to a life of self-denial. And so for Paul to be able to say this, I don't run with any kind of uncertainty. Why? Because he knows that he's not only going to be competitive, but that he would be the victor. So should we as well. We need to recognize that the Bible is very clear on this, and it is that if a person has put their trust and their faith in Jesus Christ, then their assurance of salvation is a settled matter. And yet so many people struggle with that understanding. You see, it is important for us to recognize that everything that was necessary for us to be saved was accomplished before we were born, by 2,000 years. So there is no uncertainty in this, and it's not hubris, it's not boasting, it's not bragging to say, I'm saved, because it's not conditioned on us. It's because of the work that Jesus did. That's why we're saved. It's through him that we are saved, not because of some efforts of ourselves. So Paul is able to say, there's no uncertainty in me because I know my destination and I know who has secured it for me. And in the meantime, I'm going to compete, if you will, in this whole idea of winning souls. Remember, that's what he's been talking about. I desire to win souls. So I will speak to Gentiles like Gentiles, Jews like Jews, church people like church people, and I won't look to offend any of them by the things that I do. And he finishes with that understanding. Now, Before we get to this last verse, this is an important thing for us to remember. And Paul picks up on this. There are things that we can say, and we may be great about all the things that we say, but our actions can completely make the things that we say irrelevant because of hypocrisy. And Paul touches on that as he closes this out. Verse 27 says, "But I discipline my body, and I bring it into subjection." Now, why is that? "Lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become then disqualified." So his point is, I don't want to be able to say things to people and then myself be found to be a failure or a hypocrite, because it will completely nullify all of the things that I do. So for the believers, look, we want to get out into the world. We want to be able to engage them in ways that they will understand. We want to be able to speak to them and make the truth of the gospel not only understandable, but something that they would desire for themselves. We want to make our profession of our belief and make the person of Jesus Christ real to them. And then after we've done that and explained and done those things necessary to tell them the truth, we want to make sure that our lives support our words. And so here Paul said the exact same things. I can go to Gentiles, I can go to Jews, I can go to the church, I can speak to them in terms that they will understand, and then there will also be a lifestyle that will never in any way contradict the things that I've said with my mouth. So, church, hugely important. We are put into this world to be an example to it, not just in the things that we say, but in the things that we do as well. Paul gives this admonition to us and makes it very clear how it is that we're to conduct ourselves. So as we close this chapter 9, again, I'm sorry for the break earlier in the video. It was brought to my attention and I didn't know that there was a corrupted file. So I wanted to make sure that we could close out this chapter, not just leave it kind of hanging out there. So once again, I guess that'll teach me I should make sure that these things upload properly before I put them up there. Again, my apologies, but we'll pick up in chapter 10, which here's the weird thing, it's already been recorded. And then we'll pick up in chapter 11 after that. But thank you for joining us. We really appreciate having you here with us through this ministry and the study through the book of 1 Corinthians. God bless you.